Good afternoon. Our topic today is civic engagement and human rights, reviving US democracy. My name is Matthias Rösser, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and also the co-director of graduate studies at the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics, both of those at Harvard University. And it is my pleasure to moderate this event at the intersection between these two centers. The occasion of this panel is the recent release of a report entitled Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a report issued by a commission co-chaired by Danielle Allen, one of our panelists. As its title suggests, the report is enormously ambitious. American democracy, it is fair to say, is currently not in good shape. Respect for its institutions is very low. Large numbers of Americans feel the country's political system does not work for them. And in fact, studies show that for people at middle and lower levels of wealth and income, the impact of their preferences on public policy is practically zero. The United States houses 1/4 of the global prison population, a disproportionate share of them being people of color. And more recently, it also so happens that 1/4 of the global deaths from corona are Americans. And again, people of color are disproportionately affected. There are substantially more guns in this country than there are people, and the major motive for possessing one is safety. The US does not know how to come to terms with the fact that the common person's dream of empire that this country has made true for so many has from the beginning come at the expense of so many others, those who were here before and those who were brought here in chains. Clearly, the American body politic is not in good health, and our common purpose, the report, Our Common Purpose, is explicit that a renewal at the magnitude of the post-Civil War constitutional reforms or the civil rights innovations of the 1960s is actually called for. The Commission spent 2 years engaging with communities all over the country to explore how best to respond to the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our political and civic life. And input from these sessions is visible all over the report. The report includes 6 strategies and dozens of ambitious recommendations for complete rejuvenation of civic and historic participation to help the nation emerge as a more resilient democracy by 2026, by 2026, the nation's 250th anniversary. By way of introducing our 2 panelists, let me also say a few words about the 2 participating centers in this webinar, but really the main thing to say about our 2 panelists, I should say right away, is that these are 2 distinguished thinkers and practitioners who share a lifelong struggle to give a positive and inspiring meaning to what it is to be American and what it is to be a citizen, and thus help us live together under a common purpose. The E.J. Safra Center, operating at the university level, is based on the observation that the complexity of public life makes ethical issues difficult, even for people with good moral character. The center therefore seeks to strengthen teaching and research about pressing ethical issues, to foster sound norms of ethical reasoning and civic discussion, and to share the work of its community in the public interest. The center's director, the center is fortunate to have Danielle Allen as its director, who is one of the country's most distinguished and most visible political theorists, and much of whose work in any event, one way or another, has been around the theory and practice of civic and political participation, how to make sure people are capable participants to begin with, and how to understand and react to failures in participatory practices. Welcome, Danielle. The Carr Center for Human Rights Policy is committed to the exploration and advancement of ideas that have coalesced around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose purpose is to help secure a substantial level of protections and provisions for each human being. The center is the hub for the Harvard Kennedy School's teaching, research, and training in the human rights domain. John Shattuck is a senior fellow at the center, as well as a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His career has spanned government service up to the level of Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights under Clinton, civil society work, and here most importantly, many years of service for the ACLU, and then also academia. He most recently served as the president of the Central European University in Budapest. At the Carr Center, John has been in charge of a project on renewing rights and responsibilities in the United States, which is a broadly based assessment of the human rights reality in the United States across a range of domains, from criminal justice, immigration and gun control to voting rights and racial justice. This project is not quite as far along as the project that Danielle has co-chaired, but its goal is to make recommendations to an administration with a more friendly disposition towards human rights. Welcome, John. So we are talking about two enormously ambitious projects, and we have about an hour to do it. So without further ado, then let me turn over to Danielle now.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for the invitation and the introduction. And John, it's a pleasure to be here to speak with you about our two bodies of work. The structure of the conversation, I think, is very fortuitous in the sense that there's a link between rights and both responsibilities on the one hand and effective governance. At the end of the day, a human rights conversation is about the work involved in securing rights. I think, Matthias, in the introduction, you just used the language of securing a high degree of protection and provision for every human being. And the question I think that any community that cares about human rights faces is that question of how we actually do that work of securing those rights, the protections and the provisions. Our report, Our Common Purpose, begins from the proposition that securing rights depends on a healthy constitutional democracy, which is also supported by a healthy civic culture. So I want to say more about that because really at the end of the day, what we've delivered in Our Common Purpose is a set of recommendations whose purpose is to restore the capacity of the US to secure rights, provision, protection, sustainably and over the long term. We see jeopardy and vulnerability in the present moment. We see that because of COVID. We see that because of underlying patterns with criminal justice. We see that because of economic inequality. We see that because of the ways in which regulation interferes with community-driven choice-making and definition. There are whole lots of ways in which we see our current structures and practices and culture as hindering the protection and provision of rights. So the question really is, what can we do about that? So I want to say something about what it means to build a healthy constitutional democracy supported by a healthy civic culture. And then I'll say a few words, just a few words about some specific recommendations, which I then hope we'll have a chance to talk about. When we were working on this report at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, we did what commissions coming out of an academy like that always do, which is to say we commissioned tons of research, we pulled together academics and scholars. In other words, we did all the conventional things that an elite academic institution tends to do as it's trying to understand the world around it. But we also knew that those kinds of approaches are inadequate to democracy. They're inadequate to the moment in which we find ourselves. So we also wanted to make sure that we were bringing everybody in, non-academics, people from all kinds of walks of life, people with participation commitments, people without participation commitments. We wanted to bring everybody into the process of discovery, to process together, co-process, so to speak, what exactly is our diagnosis about what we lack at the moment with regard to securing our rights. And we wanted to co-process solutions. So we held listening sessions all over the country, 50 plus listening sessions. And again, not just with people who are already voters, we also had sessions with people who aren't voters. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we held sessions with people who are naval cadets, who have fully embraced the concept of civic participation and duty and responsibility and the like. So a full range of experiences. And what we heard from those conversations is that people have felt trapped in a negative cycle with institutions that are non-responsive and leave people feeling disempowered. And in the face of institutions that don't deliver on preferences, as Matthias was describing, there's an inclination to disengage. But once people disengage, then those institutions become even less responsive. And so you end up in a virtuous, rather sort of vicious cycle. And then relatedly, you have less motivation to participate in bridging civil society organizations because the fractionalization, the division, the non-responsiveness come to the fore. And there's a general sort of demotivation for participation in civil society as well as in political institutions. So we came to see that the forward path depends on flipping equilibriums, getting ourselves out of that vicious cycle and into a virtuous cycle where political institutions are designed to be responsive, to empower people, to deliver equal representation, where they are supported by a civic culture that fosters and makes believable and justifiable a a commitment of all of us to one another and to constitutional democracy, and where a healthy civil society that really is building bridges across lines of division and reconnecting individual people to political institutions is a third part of that virtuous circle. You need all those things operating together. So then the question is, how do you get all those things? And that sounds like a pretty big ask in our current climate, right? Political institutions that actually leave people feeling empowered, that are responsive, that provide equal representation. And so there, what we recognized is we really have to work in sort of, pardon the expression, but all three buckets simultaneously. We need institutional reform. We also need investment in civil society, and especially those parts of civil society that support bridging purposes. And we also need to revitalize our civic culture by tackling some of our cultural issues head on. For example, our incredibly divisive fights over how we narrate US history. We can't ignore that as a sort of side question while we work on institutional reform, because those fights over our history, we alienate ourselves from one another. And then even if we were to design working institutions, we wouldn't be able to use them because we hate each other so much. So you actually have to work on all three things simultaneously. And so our recommendations, we have 31 altogether, but sort of they do flow into this, they sort of fit into these three categories. So just to give you a sense, with regard to empowerment and equal representation, we have several recommendations that are about making it easier to vote. So we have a recommendation around automatic voter registration. For the conditions of emergency, this pandemic, we have a recommendation around mail-in voting. That was one specific to this emergency, not a permanent recommendation. We also have a recommendation around restoring the vote to people who have served their convictions, their sentences, and are back in the community. So those are all things that are about making it easier to vote. We also think it's important to instill a culture of recognizing not just that we have a right to vote to be easy, but a responsibility to vote, a sort of concept of voter duty, so to speak. So we think that federal elections should be on a national holiday, and in particular Veterans Day, a day that symbolizes the concept that we all have responsibilities and duties to carry along with our rights in order to make this overall system one that serves effectively to secure our rights and to protect us and achieve those provisions. So Veterans Day, we think, should be our federal election day, a day off, paid holiday, so that people have time and space and resources to support participating in voting. We also think voting should be mandatory, and it matters that that mandatory requirement, as in Australia, they've had that for almost 100 years, is supported by ease of access to voting and by a culture that recognizes voting is a duty in the same way that jury service is a duty. We all instantly understand that when we get summoned to jury duty, it's our obligation, and we ought to have the same level of civic commitment around voting. So then you have the question of how civil society work supports that. The bridging work of civil society organizations is important to motivating people to do the work, do the homework of thinking about the issues and coming to their own judgments about what they're going to vote on, for example. We do think there's a lot of work to do to improve our informational ecosystem. The country has a lot of news deserts in the same way that we're used to talking about food deserts. Local news has disappeared. We don't get coverage of state capitals. We don't get coverage of city politics. And so we need to rebuild civic media. And again, I think it's important to distinguish. We don't so much need social media, which I think of as vaguely like middle school. We need civic media, where you're reconnecting high quality information to high quality relational practices. So let me just give you one example of a great experiment that we found in Lexington, Kentucky, which is an entity, a program called Civic Lex. And they've taken social media tools, online platforms, to build journalistic structures that provide investigative journalism covering local issues, explanatory journalism explaining the municipal budget, explaining county water policy, for example. But then they also build in a relational element. They connect the online work to in-person fora, where they have a rule of thumb that there can never be more than 7 members of the public for every public official, whether elected or appointed. So in other words, they're centering the question of the relationality that we bring to bear on how we co-process the information we need for decision-making. So a civic media ecosystem is partly about the quality of the information, that it adhere to journalistic standards, but it's also about the fact that we process that information together in relational contexts that require us to be responsible to each other, not troll each other, not abuse each other, not express contempt in relationship to each other. And so as I talk about the institutional changes to our voting system, the cultural changes to our concept of voter duty. I'm also wanting to highlight those changes in civil society that we need in order to give people the media ecosystem, the informational ecosystem that can sustain their participation, sustain it cognitively, but also sustain it at an emotional level and a sort of sense of relational commitment to others. So I hope that gives you a picture of how we are imagining the sort of virtuous circle of our reforms working together. That is the goal. And as I said, we do understand a human rights project to be at the heart of that, because we think that virtuous circle is what you need in order to secure rights inclusively for all.
Thank you, Danielle. Actually, before turning to John, let me just ask you one question right away with a request for further elaboration on this theme of co-processing things. So one of your strategies, so strategy 6, is to inspire a culture of commitment to American constitutional democracy and one another. And one recommendation under that rubric that pertains to that strategy is that basically, with an eye on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, you want to create a Telling Our Nation's Story initiative to actually create more awareness of this complexity of historical narratives that have fed this country. And that, of course, is something that is very much on people's minds right now, right? That we just see this clash of narratives that one person's America is clearly not another person's America. Can you just elaborate on that aspect of that strategy a bit more?
Sure, happy to. And here I'll say something which may surprise you, which was that President Trump's executive order around building a garden of national heroes was not crazy, okay? The method he proposed, that I would not endorse, but the concept that we are actually due a moment of working together to figure out a new approach to what we want to memorialize is actually correct. And I think it's really important to say out loud, I don't think this has been said out loud in the press, that in that proposal coming out of the White House, there was not a single Confederate included in that garden of heroes, okay? So quietly, there was an admission from the White House that it is indeed time to move beyond being a country where we memorialize the Confederacy. That is a significant admission. It's a good table-setting admission because it then raises the question, okay, well, given that all that memorializing of the Confederacy happened in the sort of early 20th century, like it wasn't even in the 19th century, what kind of memorializing moment are we in now? What are our goals in terms of articulating who we are as a people and how we can maintain a commitment to a shared constitutional democracy? And from my point of view, that is a question that we, the people, should be broadly engaged in and working productively together to answer. In other words, we need to move past the question of, do we take this down or knock this over or leave this up? And instead to a question of, what memorials do we want? And I think if we ask that question first, then you end up opening up a huge creative space for how to repurpose existing memorials, what does get moved or what gets folded into something else, what gets adapted, et cetera. So the point is just yes, we are ripe, and this conversation could not be more important to have. We are hoping that the Federation of State and Territorial Humanities Councils will be able to take a leading role in moving such conversations forward, but it is just fundamentally important that they be grassroots, bottom-up, co-processing conversations, not top-down lists of what the answer should be.
Thank you, Danielle. Turning over to John now.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Danielle. It's a great privilege to be here with you, and I've admired your work for so long, and now here we are. And I think we share three things between these two projects. Ours is very nascent still, as Matthias has pointed out, and yours is fully developed. But let me say what the three things are. I think we have a similar ambition of scope. In fact, probably, at least maybe in our case, people say the scope is so grand that it's almost impossible to imagine how you're going to reach that scope. The second is we have a shared sense of crisis and the need for this kind of a project. And the third is that the crisis indeed to change, and that this is really the driving force behind the optimism that we have. So our project is entitled Renewing Rights and Responsibilities in the United States. A tall task, needless to say. And let me just do three things rather quickly, and then we can move to discussion of all of this and the relationship between the two projects. First, why rights and why are they important even today? How do they relate to American identity, and why is it important that we think about renewing them? Second, what is the nature of the crisis in which the rights now are being considered by this project? And the project is really to take a snapshot of the condition of rights in the United States today. And third, what are some of the reasons why I believe this is a transformational moment and a moment for potential great change in the area of democracy and rights that we're talking about in both of these projects? So first, the theoretical framework, just a word or two about it. We are, of course, a nation of ever-increasing diversity, of racial, ethnic, cultural, religious diversity. And the question arises when one asks what it is to be an American. What can possibly hold us together in this very great, diverse experiment called the United States, which right now is going through some extremely difficult times? And I think the answer, at least from our point of view, is that there is a system buried deep in US history of rights and mutual responsibilities that, at least in theory, can bind together the citizens to each other and to the government. Now, the core of the rights system are two aspects: liberty and equality. They're mutually dependent. Danielle, you've written very eloquently about this. Both need to exist in order to safeguard against domination by tyranny of the majority or domination by a tyrannical government. But they need to be balanced against each other. And unfortunately, in much of American history, liberty has dominated over equality. And from the very beginning, certainly the history of genocide and slavery is the most dramatic example of that in terms of any ideas of equality. And in practice, liberty has become somewhat exclusionary, quite exclusionary, in fact, blocking claims of equality in a lot of aspects of American history. So countless Americans have fought and died for liberty and equality. These rights they have fought to gain, and these rights they have fought to defend. And the history of rights in many ways is a history of the ongoing struggle for inclusion of all people within the framework of rights, so that it is not simply my liberty and you're going to be excluded. It's everybody should be included in the system. So that's really the theory under which we're operating and producing this, this project. The four crises that we face today, which I think define the ongoing struggle for rights, a struggle which has been going on since the very beginning of the country. First, of course, the political crisis of polarization and division, stimulated by political leadership often and politics of grievance. The second is the public health crisis, which has descended on us and we're in the midst of course, and it's affecting all aspects of our lives and directly affecting human rights and responsibilities through the shutdown and then reopening and the failure of government to manage any aspect of that crisis in a way that would alleviate some of the suffering going on. The third is the economic crisis, which in many ways flows from the public health crisis, but is deeper than that, spotlighting inequalities in our system of economic system and the failure of the economy in relation to many of its citizens, certainly. And the fourth crisis, which encapsulates all of them, is the racism crisis, which is most dramatically illustrated by the police murder of George Floyd, and also, of course, by the disparate impact of the pandemic crisis on people of color across the country. The Black Lives Matter movement that has emerged and the huge civil society responses that have taken place, I think, give us cause for some degree of optimism that it's possible to push back against the systemic racism crisis. But we also have to remember that there's an ongoing white backlash and a fear of demographic change, which has produced a lot of tension and challenge in American rights. So out of these four crises and out of this moment that we're in, I believe we have an opportunity for transformation. There are previous moments in our history that have demonstrated similar types of crises and out of which transformations of rights and responsibilities have come. Certainly, the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, which many historians have called the second founding, in which the post-Civil War amendments that are at the heart of our equal protection system of rights in the United States came. Of course, those were almost immediately attacked by a very reactionary approach toward rights that took place after the Reconstruction. Then there was the New Deal after the Depression, which produced a great advance in what we call economic rights, particularly from a freedom from want and a better look at the ways in which discrimination was affecting so many people at the bottom of the economic heap. And then finally, the Civil Rights Revolution after decades, indeed a century of segregation following the Civil War, which led to major advances, legislative advances in civil rights. So all of these point the way toward what could be a moment of transformation. And I believe that the civil society activism that's been exhibited in the most recent period is a demonstration of how that optimism may be warranted in many respects. So the purpose of our initiative is to look at 6 areas of rights, all based in the US Constitutional Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence framework, but also reinforced by the international human rights law in which the US has played a major role over a long period of time, despite the fact that it's no longer willing to play such a role, and indeed is playing a contrary role vis-a-vis international human rights law. And the 6 areas are equal protection, race, gender, LGBTQ plus rights, disability rights, due process of law, where we look at issues of immigration, gun rights and public safety, which is a very controversial area of rights, but a very important area of potential balancing of rights protected in one aspect of the Constitution against the public right to safety. The First Amendment rights of speech, media, and religion, and hate crimes, which are an extreme version of speech not protected by the First Amendment, and a dangerous example of what can happen to a society in which people are in a very divisive mode as they are today. The democratic process, where we share a lot of commonality with the project that Danielle has outlined for you, where we're looking at voting rights, money in politics, civic education, and indeed endorse many of the recommendations that she has gone over here. And then 2 others, privacy, the personal data and surveillance with personal data protection and the concerns that Americans have about that, and sustainability, which is really a whole set of issues around economic rights, health, education, housing, environmental safety. We're conducting a national opinion poll, even as we speak here today. It's going on this month to test the attitudes of Americans toward each of these rights and toward the whole concept of rights at the time of this pandemic and all the other crises that I've mentioned. We've conducted focus groups in 3 parts of the country to test the public opinion on these issues, and that will all be coming reflected in the report that we will issue sometime in September. So finally, let me just say we have 2 sets of recommendations, 2 categories of recommendations. We have things that are incremental and can be done immediately, say in the first 100 days, were there to be a more friendly administration toward rights through executive orders and appointments and the like. And then systemic and long-term changes, some of them similar to the ones being recommended by the Academy Project, where we, among other things, are going to be recommending a significant reimagining of law enforcement in response to a lot of the outcry that's come in recent weeks following the Black Lives, as part of the Black Lives Matter pressures that have been brought to bear. So that's a quick summary. Matthias, let me turn it back over to you, and obviously we could have a dialogue on any of these topics.
Thank you, John. There's one question that came from the audience already, which I will just turn back right to you on how one builds coalitions about putting something like this into practice. And let me frame this in a somewhat broader way. So, of course, one of the concerns that is in the air right now and has been for years is about a disconnect between the intellectual establishment, the liberal elite, the universities, and the population, right? So that universities are not playing the kind of role within the fabric of society that we really need them to play. And one thing I find quite remarkable about both the Academy report, Danielle's work, and the work that you are doing, John, that we are doing at the Carr Center, is that they both involve these listening sessions, right? So these are not meant to be top-down, recommendations. Here's what we as academics think you should do, but there's actually already a conversation built in, right? Listening sessions, advice. The Academy report is really quite remarkable in this way that there are some quotes also very prominently placed to really bring out the voices, the many of the voices behind that. So there is already an effort there at really bringing people in a way, in this kind of preemptive way. But of course, one does wonder, right? So here we are, Harvard University. We are targeted quite a bit as the kind of the embodiment of detachment. So, John, how do you envisage this? How do you envisage for the work that you are doing, that we are doing at the Carr Center, to have an impact, to change things, and then presumably through coalition building? How do you see that going down?
Well, what we are doing, as you mentioned, and certainly the Academy did this as well, is to spend a lot of time listening to people. We listened to people around the country. We had a lot of input from town hall meetings that we conducted in Detroit, in Atlanta, and in Phoenix, Arizona, in 3 very different areas. We're now conducting this national opinion poll. We've also been hosting a whole series of outreach events with, of course, virtually right now because of the pandemic, with civil society groups to gather the kind of information that needs to go into this, and also to make clear that there's a stake in our project for everyone. This is not something that's top down. It's actually reflecting the urgency and the needs for a rights renewal in order to go back to the very main point that I made, which is, who are we as Americans? I think all Americans have this feeling. One point I would make on the public opinion side, which I think reflects the approach that we're taking toward coalition building, is that we have found already that there is almost unanimity across the political spectrum, and we've talked to people from all sides of the spectrum, that rights are in danger today, that they are in danger in a variety of different ways. There's disagreement, of course, about which rights are most important, that's for sure. But the fact that people recognize that this is part of their culture and their identity, and that they have a stake in it, is the kind of thing that we would like to bring out in this project. And we're certainly not perfect. We do bear the Harvard name, which is a wonderful name, but doesn't necessarily help reach lots of people of that kind. Final point I would make is that we are in a very political time now, and obviously there's an election coming up, and there are many public policy makers to whom we are going to be appealing. And that's all part of building a coalition. It cannot just be grassroots. You've got to talk to the people who are influential.
And yeah, let me ask you a version of that same question also. So here we are, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, issues this really wonderful report. And clearly the historic dimension of that is enormous. It's done with an eye on 2026, which is a really big, it's a big anniversary, 250 years, and a territorial democracy of this size. I mean, this is like, by historical standards, the United States is quite an amazing thing. Whatever else you want to say, it's quite amazing that there is a 250 years of a democracy there. So it's a big year. But here also the question is, how do you, so this important work that you guys have now done, how do you expect it to make its way into the fabric of society? What is going to happen between now and 2026 to bring about some of that, hopefully all, but at least some of the change that you are suggesting?
So I think it's really interesting how there's a thread of this conversation, which is about how academic work can make a difference in the world. So a thread of the conversation, which is about what people sometimes call translational work or impact work. And I think once we are in that conversation, it's really good for us to think about the biomedical sciences and the kind of fact that they have been able for the last 25 years to build a model by which basic science, basic research moves into direct application. In fact, we're all watching the importance of that infrastructure translation right now as we watch Moderna pursue this vaccine. So the fact that they've been able to move as quickly as they have on an innovative vaccine reflects the fact that they had done a ton of basic science already, but also that they had built these sort of translational structures that bridge the space between sort of theory and practice, so to speak. So that was a long frame. But the point of all of that was to say, for our report, we're experimenting. We are being very intentional about the question of how you take work coming out of the social sciences and the humanities and also achieve translational impact, because the academy really is an academic vehicle, and mostly what it does is generate expert knowledge. So the academy is itself not going to be the implementer of these recommendations, but neither do we want our report to be something that gets dusty on somebody's shelf somewhere. So what we spent the last 6 months before report release doing was trying to identify and recruit champions for each of the 31 recommendations in the report. So it's not as if we invented these recommendations sort of out of nowhere. For the most part, they were good ideas that somebody else had already mooted somewhere in our big, broad national conversation. And what we really did was sort of sift through to find the set that together would be the most impactful set, serving that purpose of that virtuous circle I described. So then it became incumbent on us to elevate the people who are already doing the work on behalf of any one of them. It was incumbent on us to introduce them to one another so they could make a bigger field of practice and recognize that they're pulling together in the same direction and perhaps pool their energies and be able to broaden and strengthen their impact by achieving a higher degree of coordination. So, we've been jokingly talking about how for the next couple of years, we're going to be running kind of breakfast of champions, on a regular basis to make sure that there's that kind of sense of alignment, that sense of shared common purpose, that motivation, and a higher degree of coordination. So we see ourselves as a catalyst, and we're looking to folks who are already driving change as the real implementers of the work.
Thank you. As we talked earlier before the session, there was one potential area of disagreement between the two of you, namely about the mandatory voting, and this is also being picked up in the audience. Some audience questions are about the mandatory voting. The larger context here. So both of these efforts, John, you talk about human rights and responsibilities. Danielle, your report talks a lot about civic duties. So being a citizen is not just is very different from being a recipient, right? You are an actor, and being an actor involves also duties that are required to maintain the structure within which you're acting. So that's something that you share, that you're emphasizing the duty and responsibility dimension. But then I sensed, John, that you are not very fond of mandatory voting, and a person in the audience put this by saying, well, Danielle, you compared this to jury duty. There's so many people who would do not literally anything, but a lot of things to avoid jury duty. So that does not make it attractive. So before, Danielle, asking you to defend this, John, would you like to articulate what your concerns are about mandatory voting?
Well, they're actually, oddly enough, I'm probably more personally sympathetic to it than I am institutionally sympathetic. I represent obviously a civil liberties perspective here, and there are certain basic rights and certainly responsibilities that Americans have. But the responsibilities are not things that are mandated. They are morally required. And I believe there is a moral obligation to vote, no question about it. But when you get to mandating something, you no longer really make it responsibility. In fact, you make it something that is a law that you have to comply with. And in this case, it's a law that goes to one of the most basic elements of what it is to be an American. Do you vote or not vote? I wish voting were much higher in terms of the percentages. We do a terrible job in the United States in comparison with many other countries in terms of voter turnout, but some of those other countries are mandatory. That's true. So I think that the final point I would make is simply that there is clearly a responsibility to participate in a democracy if you want your voice to be heard and you want to reap the benefits of living in a democracy which protects your rights. But that's different from a mandate or a requirement. And once it's a mandate or a requirement, it is enforceable by the government. And obviously it has to be that people have to figure out how they're going to enforce that. And do you conduct sort of check-ins and what's the level of enforcement and all the rest of it. Now, I think Danielle rightly looks to Australia, which I think has a fairly reasonable system where the enforcement mechanisms are quite mild. But that's my view. So let me turn it back to you.
So before turning over to Danielle for the defense on that, let me just add one component to that. So Danielle, your report is really quite heavy on expectations, right? So there is the mandatory voting, but then there's also something else that you have, namely, you call that a universal expectation of a year of national service. Yeah? So it's not mandatory in this case, but universal expectation. So it's as strong a formulation shy of being mandatory. So you are asking quite a bit, of Americans who are not used to being asked to do such things. Can you elaborate maybe on both of these aspects of the duty components of your report?
Sure, no, absolutely. I'm happy to. And it's great that you put those together, Matthias, because of course, that's the option. We could have advocated a mandatory draft, but we were advocating mandatory voting. I'm sort of joking, but it's an important comparison because of course, this country did have a draft until the early 1970s. We had a very different conception of the basic burden of service that would be required by law. That doesn't keep it from being a responsibility. There's moral responsibilities. There are also moral responsibilities that we encode in law, and there are still moral responsibilities. They also become legal responsibilities, right? And we had a much higher threshold for what we thought, which moral responsibilities we thought we should encode in law up until just a couple of generations ago. I think it is correct to say that the erosion of the functioning of our constitutional democracy is tied to that downshifting in our conception of what we should ask of ourselves and one another. And I do think we have to rebuild the degree to which we're asking things of ourselves. So then the question is, which are the things that we really should think of as necessary parts of national service at this point in time? And when you lay those functions out on the table, voting is the one that rises to the top. We really do need to draw our whole population back into the process. This would actually, the odds are, help moderate our politics by introducing voters who are perhaps a little less polarized already, a little less intensely engaged, and therefore give candidates a chance to campaign in a different fashion. And so there are many reasons to think that this is a great value. John's quite right that we chose the Australian model, which is a light touch version of a mandatory voting system. The fines are minimal. There's no expectation that you positively cast a vote for anything. You can cast an empty ballot. What matters is that you participate and show up. And so then it also matters, this is a large part of the reason why we invested a lot of time in thinking about rituals and how do we build a culture of enthusiasm for participation. That is, there were times in our country's history where voting was fun and people came out and there were parties and there were parades. And so that's really why connecting this to a national holiday is so important. So yes, mandatory, but also fun, okay? And not a draft, so that's a bonus.
Okay, thank you. Let me shift gears a little bit. We already talked about the, you mentioned the sculpture garden that Trump suggested, which, actually I also noticed this was quite remarkable that they were moving away from honoring the Confederates. So, but the larger context for that topic is also I mean, it's not just about statutes, but the grappling with systemic racism in the United States is one of the huge topics at the moment. And there, of course, one could expect a lot of incredulous stares, right? When you say, well, we need to build a common purpose, and we are going towards the 250th anniversary of the country, and we're just coming increasingly to see how much systemic racism there is, or some people increasingly come to see that, and many other people are digging in, right? And they say, well, that really is some version of fake news. And so that will be one reaction that you can expect to the report, and certainly to any talk of common purpose. So how can there be, Danielle, how can there be a common purpose at all in light of these so divergent views about where the country is with regard to systemic racism?
So, I mean, I think it's important that in our report, we don't claim that we collectively currently believe in, feel, find ourselves affected by a sense of a common purpose. We see the project of a common purpose as something to achieve. There is remediation to be done in order to achieve a common purpose. There's the sort of co-processing that we've been talking about, but we think it's the right statement of aspiration. And in fact, what I would say is that what your question does is actually precisely sort of map out the work to be done. That is, to get from a place of where we are to a place where we can truly say we have a common purpose, we have to address precisely the issues that you've put on the table. But I think it's also important to say that the structural and the cultural are not separate from each other. And here I would want to really point to the work of Bryan Stevenson, which I think is very compelling in its articulation of how institutional practices and our cultural understandings interact with each other. So Bryan Stevenson, of course, is the person who runs the Equal Justice Initiative, which has done sort of death row advocacy and defense litigation and litigation of innocence and things like that, mostly in the South, but probably elsewhere also for many, many years now, decades. And he has innumerable victories where he's managed to win people released from unjust convictions or sentences. However, for all of his success, Bryan reached a point where he realized that the single biggest obstacle to his achieving justice for his clients was not anything in the legal system per se. It was the understandings of history that jurors walked into his courtroom with. So the jurors in his courtroom did not understand why defendants they saw in front of them, Black defendants, they were white jurors, found themselves in the circumstances they found themselves in of poverty and disadvantage or whatever. And so Bryan realized in order to have fairness inside our courtrooms, he needed to actually work on cleaning up the country's understanding of history. And so, his first project was in Montgomery, where he works, to go ahead and try to get the city to set up monuments to the history of enslavement or memorials about the history of enslavement. So when he started his work, Montgomery, though it was one of the biggest trading centers, it has a river and it has warehouses, one of the biggest trading centers for the trade in enslaved people, had not a single historical marker to that practice. It did, however, have many markers to the Confederacy. And so that was his first goal, was just to get 1, 2, 3, 12 markers to actually make the history of enslavement visible in Montgomery. Now, of course, he's built the Monument to Peace and Justice, which makes the history of lynching and racial violence visible. But one of the most important things that he's done in doing that work is that his point is that, he's not there to punish. The point of the memorial is not to punish. The point of the memorial is to build a foundation for shared and accurate understanding. And I think as he talks about his work, if you have the chance to talk to him about it, one of the things that's most compelling is the way in which even the very same office holders who were resistant to the addition of the memorials to enslavement in the first instance, wanted to keep it to just the memorials to the Confederacy, have gone through his memorial and been affected and moved by it and had a kind of reorientation and perspective. So at any rate, that was a sort of long story, but the point I want to make about it is that what we know about ourselves as a people, what we know about our history, directly pertains to how well our institutions function to secure rights.
Thank you. John, let me also pose a version of this question to you. So If you look at the human rights movement, if you go to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you see a lot of prominence to anti-discrimination. Basically, Articles 1 and 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights both enshrine that, right? So before you come to Article 3, where it says something about the right to life, you have already heard twice that discrimination is a huge issue in society. So that's in a way how the human rights, how important the human rights tradition thinks anti-discrimination work is. And I know that as we have gone through our work on the renewal of human rights and responsibilities this last year, systemic racism has played an enormously important role in this work, has played an enormously important role at the Carr Center. Of course, any human rights center worth its salt these days has to be, has to have a strong focus on this kind of work. And you do that in this work very much. Could you elaborate on this a little bit more, how dealing with systemic racism comes into your work?
Yes, but rather than looking at it from a kind of legal and international human rights law perspective, let me also reflect on the point that was made by Danielle in response to your earlier question, because I think the real heart of this struggle right now, and what does give me some degree of optimism, is the new linkage between what I would call civic education and civic activism. And I think civil society, and it's having lived and worked abroad frequently as well as in the United States, I must say that the dynamism of American civil society remains one of its greatest assets. And I think what we saw in the Black Lives demonstrations and all the broad racial aspects of those demonstrations, and the fact that particularly a lot of younger people indicates the power of the changing opinion that's coming through civil society activism. Now that can't simply be done alone, though. It takes also a great deal of civic education, and I think the Brian Stevenson story is a very powerful one. One of our principal recommendations in our report is going to be for a massive amount of additional funding and focus in educational institutions across the country on civic education. It will also be part of a set of recommendations we're going to do around systemic racism, and particularly around reparations, where we believe that, in fact, the country needs to make more statements as a country with respect to the way it's treated racial minorities over a long period of time. Obviously, Native Americans in particular, slaves as well. But so there is, I think, a civic education, civic activism connection in the United States that I think gives me, and also a generational change that I think has occurred within particularly younger people with respect to their attitudes toward race as the country becomes more and more diverse. So this is how we're infusing this throughout our report. We're obviously looking at the legal questions too. What kinds of legal changes are needed in order to be able to renew rights in the area of non-discrimination that's also coming.
Thank you. So another question that came from the audience is about the relevance of economic inequality in the context of civic engagement. And I want to frame that as a question for Danielle and also tie this to another of Danielle's work. So Danielle, you have my favorite among your books is our declaration, your book on the Declaration of Independence. And what I like about it especially is how you work out that the ideal of equality is present in the Declaration of Independence much more strongly than it is commonly perceived, right? The liberty aspect is seen very clearly and very strongly, but there is a very pronounced understanding of equality as non-domination in there that you, I think, absolutely correctly diagnose as having been formulated at the outset of this country. And in fact, the declaration then ends by saying, we all put our fortunes together to make this work out, right? So there's a pretty substantial egalitarian ideal right in the founding document. But if you look at the reality, especially the reality as it's been unfolding over the last several decades, the the extent of economic in this country is enormous. It leads to all sorts of political distortions, money in politics, lack of reflection of preferences of low-income people. So in political decisions, how can we make progress on civic engagement, improvements in citizenship without substantially reducing economic inequality, and thereby finally getting to the ideal that was formulated in the Declaration of Independence, Danielle?
So I'm a person who thinks about political economy with the starting point that it's actually our political and legislative decisions that result in an economy that's either egalitarian or inegalitarian in its consequences. That is to say, I would argue against the views that there are, in some sense, natural laws or activities that are separate from the legal regimes. To the contrary, it's the legal regimes that give us the dynamics and laws of our economies. And in making this argument, I'm sort of following the lines of economists like Danny Roderick or Daron Acemoglu at MIT. And so they both, and others as well, point out that in order to achieve more egalitarian economies, where both the sort of structures of production and the patterns of distribution are more egalitarian in terms of their own ongoing basis, leaving aside questions of redistribution. What you in fact actually need is broad base of participation and egalitarian politics. And so Daron tends to point to moments in the 19th century, for example, the repeal of the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom as a moment where expansion of the franchise resulted in a more egalitarian political economy. Similarly, in the US in the early 20th century, expansion of the franchise was connected to a more egalitarian political economy. So in that regard, my view as a scholar is that by reviving the participatory power of our democratic structure, we equip ourselves to deliver more egalitarian political economy as well. So, the report and the recommendations also do include responses to the issue of campaign finance and the importance of money in politics, robust disclosure laws, for example, so there's no dark money in politics. These can be legislated at the level of the state, so it doesn't actually require federal action. It is also worth saying that the single constitutional amendment that we advocate in the report would be one that repeals the impact of Citizen United and the special provision given to corporations there.
Thank you. Since we are almost at the end, I just have one final question for both of you. It's actually a two-part question, but I hope for kind of concise answers in light of the time. So the question is, in light of all this divisiveness and pain that we are observing in this country in 2020, what does it mean to be an American? What can it mean to be an American? What does it mean to you? And kind of connected to that, what do you want the audience to take away from this and do to make good on an ideal of American citizenship that you yourself would like to advance? And I turn to John for that first, and then Danielle. You're muted, Sir John.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I said earlier that I think what it means to be an American above all is to have a sense that I have rights and I have responsibilities. Now, that's obviously my own perspective, but I think it's a perspective shared by very many Americans, if not, I would say an overwhelming majority. What those rights are is a matter of disagreement, but it shows that I think underneath everything and all the disputes and the difficulties that we have now, polarization, divisiveness, systemic racism, etc., there is a shared set of values, and those values are reflected in rights. And we need to be able to exercise those rights. And Danielle's project, I think, does a great job of showing us how we can actually strengthen our institutions so that rights are enforced and exercised and the whole system works more effectively. And that's what I would like to believe.
Thank you, Danielle.
So, no, it's a great question. And we asked that on these listening sessions all around the country. And similar to what John just said, actually, so the first thing we found was that if you asked people what they thought it meant to be an American, what they thought they shared with other Americans, the answer would be, well, none of us share anything with anybody else. So we share the fact that we don't think we share anything. Okay, so that's the thing to be American, is to think that you don't share anything with your fellow Americans. And the second thing would be, yes, despite thinking they didn't share anything, most people were using a vocabulary of rights and responsibilities. So we do actually share that vocabulary. And then the third thing that we found that it means to be American is actually there was just incredible love of country everywhere we went. And what does that love mean? I think it means different things for different people. Some people love the landscape. Some people love the music. Some people love their specific neighbors. But really, I mean, it matters that it's not just the abstract, recognition that rights and responsibilities are key to human flourishing and that we sort of share that kind of premise. But we actually have a kind of weird, quirky love of our weird, quirky, idiosyncratic country. The mixture, the inventiveness, the dynamism that John referred to. I think the list of what people put on the table about what they love is like long and not perfectly overlapping. But that there is love broadly across this country for this place, without question. That is the case.
Thank you. So we are out of time. So let me say by way of concluding this, I think the kind of work that you both do, Danielle and John, is the kind of work that this university needs to do, that universities generally need to do in order to play their part in society and also bringing society to a better place. So I personally feel greatly honored being colleagues with you in these endeavors and doing this kind of work. And I sincerely hope for our efforts, but also for the sake of the country and the love that we have for the country, as you pointed out quite correctly, Danielle, that these efforts come to fruition. There's an enormous amount of potential here, and I hope that at the very latest in 2026, we will look back and we'll look back at several years of progress. That is a hope. It's not an unreasonable hope, and we'll now have to get to work to make sure that the hope comes true. So thank you both. Thank you, John. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And I guess you all have your work cut out for yourselves now, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.